1222. Europe is ruled by kings who answer to no law, monarchs who can take your land, your property, your life on a whim. The Magna Carta was signed 7 years earlier in England, and the king has already ignored it 3 times. There is no constitution, no Bill of Rights, no legal framework protecting citizens from the crown. That same year in West Africa, the Mali Empire proclaims a charter, a written constitution, with 44 articles guaranteeing human rights, outlawing slavery, protecting women and children, establishing rules of war, and limiting governmental power. It's called the Manden Charter, and it won't just be ignored like the Magna Carta. It will be memorized, recited, and enforced across an empire larger than Western Europe for the next 400 years. European scholars will discover it centuries later, and they will refuse to call it a constitution. Because if West Africa had constitutional governance in 1222, then everything you were taught about African political development is a lie. So let me show you what this document said, how it was preserved, and why they've spent 800 years trying to pretend it didn't exist. Europe, 1222. Power is absolute. Kings rule by divine right. God chose them, and no human law can challenge them. If the king wants your land, he takes it. If he wants your daughter, he takes her. If he suspects you of disloyalty, you disappear. There is no appeal, no trial, no rights. In England, yes, the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. You've heard of it. You were probably taught it was the foundation of constitutional government, the beginning of democracy, the birth of human rights. Here's what they didn't teach you. King John signed it because rebel barons held swords to his throat. He didn't believe in it. He didn't want it. He signed it to survive. And the moment those swords were gone, he asked Pope Innocent III to annul it. The Pope agreed, called it illegal and unjust. The Magna Carta was void within 3 months. 3 months, the document your textbooks celebrate as the foundation of Western liberty, lasted 90 days before the king threw it away. It gets reissued in 1216 when John dies. His son ignores it. Reissued in 1217, ignored again. Reissued in 1225, violated immediately. Over the next century, the Magna Carta will be reissued, revised, and violated more than 40 times. 40 times, because no one follows it, because it has no enforcement mechanism, because kings do whatever they want, and it doesn't even protect regular people. Read the actual Magna Carta. It protects barons, nobles, the feudal elite who forced the king to sign it. If you're a peasant, which is 90% of the population, you have 0 rights under the Magna Carta, none. You can still be taxed into starvation. Your lord can still take your land. You can still be executed without trial. The Magna Carta doesn't care about you. This is Europe's celebrated constitutional heritage in 1222. A document that gets ignored 40 times, only protects the rich and grants no rights to common people. Now, let me show you what was happening in West Africa that same year, and let me show you why the contrast should make you angry. The Mali Empire, founded by Sundiata Keita after defeating the Soso Kingdom at the Battle of Kirina in 1235. Sundiata doesn't just conquer territory, he unifies peoples. 12 kingdoms, dozens of ethnic groups, different languages, different religions, different traditions. Mandinka, Soninka, Fulani, Wolof, Bambara, animists, early Muslims, traditional spiritualists. This isn't a homogeneous state. This is diversity on a massive scale. And Sundiata knows that military conquest alone won't hold an empire like this together. You need more than swords. You need law. You need a framework that people believe in, that they'll defend, that they see as legitimate. You need rights that protect citizens and limits that constrain power. So around 1222 to 1236, the oral traditions differ on the exact year. Sundiata convenes an assembly. The Gbara, representatives from all 12 kingdoms, nobles, warriors, hunters, griots, spiritual leaders, clan elders, and together they proclaim the Manden Charter. Kouroukan Fouga in Mandinka, 44 articles, a complete constitutional framework for governance. And here's the part that should stop you. It wasn't written on paper, it was written in the minds of the griots. And it would stay there, word for word, for the next 800 years. Let me explain what that means. The Jeli, the griots, you've probably heard the word. Maybe you think it means storyteller or musician. It means so much more than that. Griots were living libraries, human archives. They memorized entire legal codes, genealogies going back centuries, historical accounts, treaties, constitutional frameworks, not summaries, not paraphrases, word for word. A master griot could recite 50,000 lines of text from memory with perfect accuracy. They trained from childhood, started memorization at age 5 or 6, studied for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years before being considered fully trained. They used mnemonic techniques we still don't fully understand. Musical patterns, rhythmic structures, linguistic devices that locked information into memory so securely it couldn't be forgotten. And this wasn't individual knowledge, it was collective. Multiple griots memorized the same texts. They recited publicly, in front of other griots who knew the material. If you got a word wrong, you were corrected immediately, in public, in front of everyone. This wasn't telephone game. This wasn't stories changing over time, details getting fuzzy, facts drifting. This was exact preservation. Anthropologists have tested this. They recorded griot recitations of the Manden Charter in the 1960s, then again in the 1980s, then in the 2000s. Different griots, different villages, different lineages, word for word identical. 800 years of oral transmission, zero drift. Think about what that means. Europe was writing things down on parchment and paper, and those documents burned in fires, rotted from moisture, got lost in wars, were destroyed by conquering armies. The Library of Alexandria, gone. Countless medieval manuscripts, gone. Legal codes, treaties, histories, lost forever because paper is fragile. But the Manden Charter survived. In human memory, passed mouth to ear across 30 generations, and every single word is still intact. This isn't primitive. This is one of the most sophisticated knowledge preservation systems in human history. Let that sink in. While Europe was losing documents left and right, West Africa was building a preservation system so reliable that texts could survive centuries without a single written backup. And Western scholars dismissed it, called it oral tradition, as if that meant unreliable. Folklore, mythology, not real evidence. Here's what they won't tell you. Oral preservation in West Africa was more reliable than written preservation in Europe, more accurate, more stable, more resistant to destruction. The griots didn't just memorize the Manden Charter, they protected it. They kept it alive through wars, droughts, famines, regime changes. They preserved it through the collapse of the Mali Empire, through the rise of the Songhai Empire, through centuries of political upheaval. And when European colonizers arrived and tried to erase it, the griots kept reciting, in secret if necessary, the underground if they had to, but they never stopped, because this wasn't just a document to them. This was identity, heritage, the constitutional soul of their civilization, and they were not going to let it die. 800 years, perfect preservation, no paper, no parchment, no written backup, just human memory, human dedication, and a preservation technology Europe didn't have the sophistication to understand. If you're realizing that everything you learned about African knowledge systems was wrong, stay close, because now I'm going to show you what this constitution actually said. And it's going to challenge everything you thought you knew about 13th century political thought. Let me take you inside the Manden Charter, not article by article like a boring legal document, but the way you'd discover a treasure, layer by layer, revelation by revelation. First, the foundation, the philosophical core that everything else builds on. Every life is a life. That's how it opens. 4 words that contain an entire theory of human equality, not royal lives matter or noble lives matter. Every life is a life. Every human being has inherent value, inherent dignity, inherent worth, not based on birth, not based on status, not based on wealth or power, based on existence itself. Europe won't articulate this principle for another 500 years. The Enlightenment philosophers in the 1700s will claim they invented it. They didn't. West Africa codified it in 1222. Every life is a life, thus do no harm to your neighbor. Basic human rights, protection from violence, constitutional prohibition on harm, practice mutual aid, social responsibility. Built into the constitutional framework. You are obligated to help your community. This isn't individualism. This isn't every man for himself. This is collective responsibility as constitutional law. And then it gets specific. Rights aren't just philosophical. They're enforceable. Every person has the right to life and to the preservation of their physical integrity. You cannot be harmed. Your body is protected. The state cannot torture you. Your lord cannot abuse you. This is bodily autonomy in the 13th century. Europe is still burning people at the stake, torturing prisoners, executing people for minor crimes, and West Africa has constitutional protection for physical integrity. But here's where it starts to get shocking, where it challenges everything you were taught about women in pre-modern societies. Never offend women. They are our mothers. Women's rights explicitly protected, not as property, not as subordinate, as mothers, as the foundation of society. Women, apart from their everyday occupations, should be associated with all our management decisions. Read that again. Women must be included in governance, in government, in decision-making, in political power. This is constitutionally required in 1222. Britain won't let women vote until 1918. America won't let women vote until 1920. That's 700 years later. Mali constitutionally required women in government in 1222. Let me make sure you understand the scale of what I just said. 700 years. West Africa mandated women's participation in governance 7 centuries before Europe and America allowed women to vote. And for those 7 centuries, the narrative was that Africa was primitive, that African women were oppressed, that European civilization was liberating them. The entire time, West Africa had constitutional protections for women that Europe wouldn't develop for 700 years. Now, watch what else the Charter does. War. Every civilization in the 13th century wages war. Mali is no exception, but the Manden Charter puts limits on it. Constitutional limits. Do not advance on your enemies in wartime unless you have first warned them and given them a chance to avoid conflict. Warning before attack. Attempt at peaceful resolution first. Never kill an enemy who is wounded, naked, powerless, or who has surrendered. Rules of engagement. Protections for the defenseless. This is Geneva Conventions thinking. The actual Geneva Conventions won't exist until 1864, 642 years later. Never kill a woman or child for any reason. Non-combatant immunity. Absolute protection for civilians. Europe in the 13th century. Burning villages, massacring populations, salting farmland so nothing will grow. Total war is standard practice, and West Africa has constitutional prohibitions on killing civilians. Do not kill children even if you have killed their parents. protection of war orphans. Even if you're fighting their fathers, even if their parents resisted, you cannot harm the children. This isn't barbarism. This isn't primitive tribal warfare. This is sophisticated ethical thinking about the limits of violence. And then this. Before setting fire to the bush during dry season, do not forget the little chicks whose mothers have hidden them in the straw. Environmental protection, codified in constitutional law. You must consider the ecological impact of your actions. You must protect wildlife. You must think about the consequences of what you burn. This is environmental stewardship as constitutional obligation. In 1222, Europe won't develop environmental law until the 1900s. That's 700 years of industrialization, deforestation, species extinction before Europe starts thinking about environmental protection. West Africa built it into their constitution in the 13th century. Let that sink in. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary. These weren't just pretty words. This wasn't symbolic. This was enforced. We know because travelers wrote about it. Ibn Battuta, Moroccan scholar and traveler, visits the Mali Empire in 1352. He's Muslim. He's educated in Islamic law. He's seen the great courts of Cairo, Damascus, Delhi. And here's what he writes about Mali. The Negroes possess some admirable qualities. They are seldom unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. He's describing a functioning justice system, legal protections people actually believe in. He continues, there is complete security in their country. Neither traveler nor inhabitant has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence. Complete security. You can travel through the empire without fear. Your property is protected. The law works. This isn't theory. This is lived reality. The Manden Charter wasn't just proclaimed and forgotten like the Magna Carta. It was enforced. It shaped society. It created one of the most secure, just legal systems in the medieval world. Portuguese explorers in the 15th century write similar accounts. And French travelers in the 16th century note the same thing. Mali has law, real law, functioning courts, rights that are actually protected, but they never connect it to a constitutional framework, because by the 1500s, Europe is already building the narrative they'll need to justify what comes next: the slave trade, colonization. And that narrative requires one thing: African primitiveness. So the evidence gets ignored, the traveler accounts get dismissed, the constitutional tradition gets erased. And for 500 years, the story becomes Africa had no political development until Europeans arrived. But the Manden Charter survived, because the Griots never stopped reciting it. Let me give you the timeline, because this is where the lie becomes impossible to defend. 1215, Magna Carta signed in England, protects nobles only, ignored within months. I will be violated 40+ times over the next century. 1216, Manden Charter proclaimed in Mali, protects all citizens, enforced for 400 years across an empire of millions. Think about that contrast. The document Europe celebrates lasted 90 days before being ignored. The document Africa created lasted 400 years and actually worked. 16th century, Europe still governed by absolute monarchies, divine right of kings, no constitutional limits on power. The Manden Charter is still being recited, still governing, still protecting rights. 1689, England's Bill of Rights protects Protestant property owners only, doesn't guarantee universal human rights. The Manden Charter guaranteed universal human rights 467 years earlier. 1776, American Declaration of Independence declares all men are created equal, except slaves and women and indigenous people. The Manden Charter protected everyone 554 years earlier. 1787, United States Constitution ratified. First modern Western constitution, 565 years after the Manden Charter, 5.5 centuries, 1791. French Constitution adopted, first European nation with a written constitution, 569 years after the Manden Charter. And here's the part that should make you furious. The Manden Charter prohibited offensive warfare. You could only fight defensively. The U.S. Constitution said nothing about war crimes. America would go on to wage wars of expansion, genocide against indigenous peoples, and conquest. The Manden Charter required women in governance in 1222. The U.S. Constitution didn't let women vote until 1920. That's 698 years later. The Manden Charter protected civilians in warfare and established environmental protections in 1222. The Geneva Conventions weren't established until 1949. That's 727 years later. Let me say that one more time. It took Europe more than 700 years to develop protections for civilians and the environment that West Africa had in the 13th century. And this entire time, all 700 years, the narrative was that Africa had no political development, no governance systems, no constitutional thinking, no sophisticated political thought, primitive tribal structures waiting for European enlightenment. That was the lie. And it was taught in every school, printed in every textbook, repeated until it became truth. But it was always a lie. Here's why they had to bury it. Colonization needed a moral justification. You can't just invade a continent, enslave millions of people, extract resources for centuries, and destroy entire civilizations without a story that makes it acceptable. So Europe created that story. Africans are primitive. Africans have no civilization. Africans have no governance, no law, no political systems, no history. Therefore, colonization is rescue. It's civilization. It's progress. It's a moral good. That narrative only works if you erase all evidence of African political sophistication. And the Manden Charter is devastating evidence. Because if West Africa had constitutional governance in 1222, if they had human rights protections, if they had women's rights, environmental law, and rules of war, if they had a legal system so effective that travelers from across the world commented on its justice and security, then what exactly was Europe bringing them in the 1800s when they carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference? What justified the atrocities in the Congo, where 10 million people were killed? What justified the genocide in Namibia, the colonial massacres across the continent, the theft of land and resources? Nothing. Nothing except violence and greed. So they buried the evidence. They dismissed oral tradition as unreliable, even though it was more accurate than their own written records. They taught generations of students that Africa had no history, no governance, no political thought. They erased the Manden Charter from world history. And when UNESCO finally recognized it in 2009, forced to acknowledge its authenticity after years of research, they still won't teach it. How many of you learned about the Manden Charter in school? How many world history textbooks mention it alongside the Magna Carta? Almost none. Even now, 15 years after UNESCO recognition, it's still not in the curriculum, because even now the narrative can't handle the truth. Here's what happened after colonization. French colonial forces conquer Mali in the 1890s. They impose French law, French governance, French administration, French language, and they outlaw traditional legal systems. It's not just ignored, it's actively suppressed. Griots are forbidden from teaching the Manden Charter in schools. It's classified as folklore, not law. Primitive tradition, not constitutional governance. Colonial administrators issue orders, French law only. No traditional courts, no customary law, no griot recitations in official settings. The constitutional tradition that survived 600 years through wars, droughts, regime changes, and political upheaval is severed in a single generation. By the 1920s, why most young people in French West Africa don't know the full Manden Charter. By the 1950s, it's only preserved by a handful of elder griots in remote villages, and the colonial narrative is complete. We brought civilization to Africa. We brought law and governance. Before us, they had nothing. No political systems, no constitutional thought, nothing. That's what's taught in schools. In Mali, in Guinea, in Senegal, in Burkina Faso, African children are taught to be ashamed of their own heritage. But here's what gets lost when you destroy a constitutional tradition. It's not just history, it's a living political framework. The Mali Empire at its height in the 1300s governed an area larger than Western Europe, larger than France, Spain, Germany, Italy combined. It governed millions of people, dozens of ethnic groups, multiple religions, a vast geographic diversity, and it was stable. The Mali Empire lasted more than 300 years, more than most European kingdoms. No constant civil wars like Europe, no endless dynastic struggles, no collapse into feudal chaos. And that stability came from the Manden Charter. People believed in it. They saw it as legitimate. They defended it. Travelers noted the security, the justice, the functioning legal system. That didn't happen by accident. That happened because there was a constitutional framework that worked. A framework that balanced power, protected rights, limited government, and gave people a stake in the system. When colonization destroyed that framework, it didn't just erase history. It destroyed a tradition that could have evolved, could have adapted, could have contributed to global constitutional thought. Imagine if the Manden Charter had been studied alongside the Magna Carta in Western universities, if African constitutional thinking had been incorporated into the development of international law, if the protections for women, the environment, and non-combatants had influenced European legal development, if oral preservation systems had been recognized as valid scholarship instead of dismissed as folklore. We'll never know what could have been, because they made sure it was buried. But here's what we do know. The Manden Charter survived, despite colonization, despite suppression, despite centuries of deliberate erasure. The griots kept it alive, in secret, in private ceremonies, in remote villages. They never stopped reciting it. And in the 1990s, after independence, African scholars started documenting it. They recorded the griot recitations, compared versions, verified authenticity. UNESCO sent researchers in 1998, interviewed griots across West Africa, compiled the evidence. 2009, UNESCO officially recognizes the Manden Charter as part of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. They confirm this is a constitutional document from the 13th century. It's been orally preserved with extraordinary precision. It's authentic. It's real. The world has to acknowledge it. And slowly, the narrative is changing. Mali's modern constitution, adopted in 1992, explicitly references the Manden Charter. African scholars are studying it, teaching it, reclaiming it. The oral tradition that Europe dismissed as unreliable is now being recognized as one of the most sophisticated preservation systems in human history, and people are asking questions. What else was erased? What other African political systems were dismissed as primitive? What other governance traditions were destroyed? The answer is hundreds. The Manden Charter isn't unique, it's just one of the few that survived. Ethiopia had written legal codes in the 4th century. The Akan states of West Africa had constitutional councils and checks on royal power in the 1400s. The Great Zimbabwe civilization had sophisticated governance structures in the 1200s. The Hausa city-states had complex legal frameworks, all erased from the textbooks, all dismissed as primitive, all buried under the narrative of African inferiority. but the evidence keeps surfacing. Every time it does, the lie gets harder to maintain. This isn't just about one charter. This isn't just about one empire or one moment in 1222. This is about the systematic erasure of African political achievement. When you were taught that democracy came from Greece and Rome, you weren't told about the constitutional assemblies of West Africa. When you learned that human rights evolved from European Enlightenment, you weren't told about the Manden Charter guaranteeing those rights 5 centuries earlier. When you studied the development of constitutional law, Africa wasn't in the textbook, not because the evidence didn't exist, because the narrative couldn't handle it. The entire justification for colonization, for the slave trade, for the exploitation of Africa depended on one premise. Africans were primitive and needed European civilization. The Manden Charter destroys that premise completely, utterly, undeniably. But if West Africa had constitutional governance in 1222, with human rights, women's rights, environmental protections, and rules of war that Europe wouldn't develop for centuries, then colonization wasn't rescue. It was destruction. Destruction of knowledge systems, of legal traditions, of political frameworks that actually worked. And they couldn't let you know that, but the griots kept it alive. And now the truth is surfacing. In 1222, the Mali Empire proclaimed a charter, 44 articles, human rights, women's rights, environmental protections, rules of war, limits on power. Griots memorized it, preserved it with perfect accuracy for 800 years. No paper, no backup, just human memory and dedication. European scholars discovered it, studied it, and refused to call it a constitution. Because if they admitted West Africa had constitutional governance 5 centuries before Europe, if they acknowledged that oral tradition preserved knowledge more reliably than European writing, if they taught students that the Manden Charter protected rights that Europe wouldn't recognize for 700 years, then the entire narrative of African primitiveness collapses, and the history of colonization becomes what it actually was. Not civilization, theft, not progress, destruction, not rescue, genocide justified by lies. They couldn't let you know that, but the griots kept it alive. And now, you know, this is the history they don't teach, but it's the history that needs to be told. If this changed how you see African political development, subscribe to this channel, because every week we're uncovering the constitutional frameworks, the governance systems, and the political traditions they tried to erase. Drop a comment. What other African political achievements do you think were deliberately buried? This is Ancient Africa Untold, and we're rewriting the narrative they tried to control.